Session, we have three panelists. Dr. Navroz Dawash, who is a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research. Mr. Himanshu Gupta, who's with the, currently working with the Planning Commission as a project leader engaged in rolling out the version 2 of the IESS 2047 model that you heard about in the morning. And Dr. Shrikant Gupta at the Delhi School of Economics. We'll start this session with Dr. Dawash, what we would request him is for about 15 minutes of intervention first, and then the other two speakers follow, and then we'll take up the Q&A. So Dr. Dawash, you'll be talking about the climate change negotiations and India's climate policy. Yeah, thanks.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much to ICRIER, to Rajat and others for inviting me here. I'm going to try and, to be honest, I wasn't fully aware that this session involves sort of formal presentation. So what I've put together is a little bit of some reflections, but it also encouraged a little spontaneity. So I'm signaling that with this subtitle here of my talk. What I want to do is really talk a little bit about the climate, the context, the global cooperation context, the negotiation context within which national climate policy is now being discussed in India. And I'm going to try and do very briefly three quick things. Give in a very impressionistic, conceptual way a little bit about global climate politics. Some of my friends in the audience will have seen my spiel on this before, and I apologize for that. Then talk about what it means for India, and then zoom in a little bit on this discussion we're having today about low carbon paths and plans and pathways. So I'm going to start with just one slide on this big picture, and it's a little complicated, but let me walk you through it. This is my take on global climate politics in one slide. Essentially, the climate negotiations are really, can be encapsulated in what I'm calling a trilemma. A trilemma is something where you have three objectives and you can only achieve two of them at one time. It's sort of well known sort of in macroeconomics, for example. And the three objectives are environmental integrity, equity or justice, which in the climate context is understood as a per capita entitlement to the atmosphere. And the third is another objective which has been put forward particularly by industrialized countries, which is whatever we do in terms of global cooperation can't undermine the competitiveness of countries. It can't undermine competitive disadvantage. Now, there's only a few ways to solve this trilemma. If you want to solve the environment and the equity justice story, you would go with a global regime that looks like something of an allocation of an explicit carbon budget. You say, here's the global carbon budget, let's carve it up and give it to countries. That has been very difficult for India and other countries to actually persuade the rest of the world to accept, for obvious reasons. We get a good share of the budget because historically we haven't emitted very much. But industrialized countries get a relatively small share, and that works against what they perceive as their competitiveness. What industrialized countries have argued for is what might be called a squatters' rights approach. You have a global environmental goal. Annex 1 will do mitigation to the extent they think is reasonable. So an 80% reduction target, for example, was what was talked about by Germany and others, 80% of emissions reduction by 2050. And the rest should be borne by developing countries. So non-Annex 1 countries get the residual. Developing countries cry foul and say, listen, that doesn't make any sense. It's an arbitrary division that you're doing based on what you think you can achieve in your economies. The only way to square the circle, in a sense, then, is that third axis at the bottom, which is some version of equity or justice along with competitiveness, and that is really where we are moving towards in the climate negotiations, which is this idea of bottom-up pledges. Every country puts on the table what they're going to do. So it's voluntary reductions that Annex 1 countries feel is consistent with competitiveness, and developing countries argue is consistent with their development imperatives. And that seems to be where we are going. What happens to the environment, which is the third pole up there that gets left? Well, that's the big question. Will these pledges add up to anything significant? There's some discussion of a review mechanism that tries to benchmark the pledges against the environmental outcome. And that is where the negotiations are at the moment. So that is a somewhat complicated slide, but it's a snapshot of both the politics and my reading of the resolution of that politics. So where does India fit in all this? Now, typically at this point, one would go into a recitation of India's position in terms of historic responsibility, its capability, all these sort of buzzwords that this audience probably knows quite well in the climate context. But I'm not going to do that because we've done it enough times. But I'm going to show a slightly different graph, which is one of sort of my favorite graphs by somebody who works on equity issues, Branko Milanovic. And what he's done here is he said, let's just plot country percentiles by percentile of world income distribution. And what you basically see is that even as compared to our BRICS partners, and certainly compared to the industrialized countries, a very, very, very small percentage of Indians are even above what would count as the poverty line in industrialized countries, right? What this shows is, A, if you think that energy use is closely tied to GNP growth and development, which all indicators suggest there are lots of graphs showing that, then India has a long way to go in terms of greater energy use per capita. Second, it shows that in terms of our contribution due to middle class and upper middle class type consumption to climate change, only a very small number of Indians are consuming. Now there's increasingly a very sort of an ever thicker creamy layer that does consume an awful lot. But in terms of global population distribution numbers, it's actually still a very small fraction. Most Indians really are contributing very little on a per capita basis to the global climate problem. There just happen to be a lot of Indians. This is another take on that per capita story. So given this, what we take from this is that the old story about India's per capita emissions and so on continues to resonate. These are old numbers, but I don't think that the graph has changed that much. But the second thing we see is that with a vast number of poor people, India has has good reasons to be extremely concerned about being vulnerable to climate harms. So those are the two messages I'm trying to give from this one single graph. What then should India do? Now, in my view, we actually have a twofold objective function. And too often in Indian policy, and this is where the revisionist part comes in of my sort of being a climate junkie, too often we talk only about the first bit, that we have to negotiate to limit any kind of unfair restrictions on our emissions that place an obstacle to our legitimate development. We need to have access to a lot more energy. Given the cost profile, a lot of that is going to continue to be fossil fuel energy, and any kind of artificial or unfair restrictions on that will pose a challenge to India, even as we're thinking about our transition to a low-carbon economy and a greater share of low-carbon intensity fuels. But this continues to be a concern, and it continues to be a concern because the cost of some sort of artificial restraint based on this diagram will be substantial. But the second part of this is that India does have a really big stake in more effective global climate action. It is not irrelevant to us. We have a lot of extremely poor and vulnerable people in India. And so it is in our interest to be arguing for and putting our weight behind a global community reaction that leads to a more effective climate action. And the form that that takes would be, at minimum, demanding enhanced and more serious pledges from Annex I countries, perhaps also China. There's an interesting story there about the politics that we can get into in the questions. The standard demands that we always make about finance and technology, which we keep making them because they are salient, and then the question of adaptation and support for adaptation. Those are the kinds of things that we need to be talking about. But we also need to be talking about how we pitch and how we formulate our own low-carbon approaches in order to show that we are on the side of the angels in this one. In other words, that our interest is actually in an effective climate deal, and our concerns about unfair limitations need not necessarily work against us being part of the constituency that seeks a more effective climate deal. That's the delicate balancing act that Indian climate policy has to manage. It's much simpler to say, no commitments, never, anything we do has to be financed from outside. That story doesn't fly anymore, in my view. At the same time, neither does a story that says, low carbon growth will get us there, our development is unlikely to be constrained, it's a win-win situation. I don't think that's a credible story either. We actually are, unfortunately, in this complicated world of having to balance two very contradictory impulses. So how is this taking tangible form? The immediate negotiating context for India is this Paris 2015 agreement with a weigh station in Lima at the end of this year. And there are multiple things that are important to India, but I'm zooming in on two for the purpose of this workshop. The first is that every country is supposed to put on the table intended nationally determined contributions. Now, this complicated phrase, and the climate negotiations specialize in complicated phrases, came out of Warsaw, and I was just flipping through an article where there's at least 3 pages devoted to unpacking this phrase. Each of these words has a loaded meaning, and we can again get into that in the question and answer session. But the point is, each country is supposed to talk about the form of its contribution, what sort of financial support is needed, and the adaptation requirements. And even the definition, there would be dispute about these 3 bullets. For some countries, it's much the form of contribution, that is, what a country will do for mitigation, is the primary story behind INDCs. India and others have been arguing that at minimum, the finance and adaptation story is important. We haven't really made a lot of progress in India unless, there's work going on in the ministry that I'm not aware of, which there may well be, to formulate these contributions. And it is really, really important that we get this right. This is the basis on which the negotiations will proceed in the next year. The second story is, if we are operating in a bottom-up world, the pledge world, the bottom bar of that trilemma, where does equity come in? How does equity actually get formulated? Well, there's an interesting idea doing the rounds, which goes by the name of the Equity Reference Framework. The Africa group has put it out there. So far, India has been hostile to this, but I think it's actually well worth us thinking about. And the idea is, let's look at all these pledges. They will probably be added up and benchmarked against adequacy. In other words, they'll be benchmarked against that environmental vertex of the triangle. But what Africa has been arguing, the African group has been arguing, is we need to also benchmark it against equity. What does it mean for different understandings, and there can be multiple understandings of what an equitable climate deal looks like. And so this is also a debate that's going on. So the INDCs, and then what do you do with the INDCs? How do you aggregate them? How do you benchmark them? How do we make sense of them? These are the 2 issues that really are at the core of the climate debate for the next year and a half. So, and this is my last substantive slide. So what should we be thinking about here? How do we proceed with this? Well, this is the first bullet sounds sort of motherhood and apple pie, consistent, transparent modeling, et cetera, et cetera. But the reason I put this up there is, implicit in this is, I don't think we've had a lot of this so far. We have had a bunch of different modeling runs. When Mr. Ramesh was in the ministry, he put out a report with 4 different studies coming up with enormous range of per capita emissions, similar to what Mr. Ahluwalia said this morning, 2 tons to 6 tons per capita by 2030, I think it was. And their assumptions were inconsistent, they were non-transparent. We now have the low carbon strategies report, which I think Shrikant is going to talk about. I'm happy to talk about a little bit more in the question answer. I was involved for a while. I personally don't think that report gets us far enough. It helps to some extent, but it isn't a sufficiently robust basis, in my view, for the INDCs by itself. The second piece of this, I think, and I'm very glad this workshop is occurring in this context, is this idea of operationalizing co-benefits. And the way we've talked about co-benefits so far is in tautological terms. What we say is something like this: we will only take co-benefits actions. How do you know which actions we will take? And the answer to that is, we will know co-benefits actions because they're the ones we will take. So it doesn't really help you very much. We need some kind of independent story about what constitutes a credible co-benefits action. And I and some others have done some work trying to do that. There's a paper in EPW that you all can look at. It basically involves a multi-criteria kind of approach to co-benefits. Again, happy to talk about that later. The final point I want to make, though, is if we're going to take all this forward, one reason we've had scattershot models, one reason we haven't had a lot of deliberation, one reason we haven't had a lot of transparency is I don't think we're sensibly institutionalizing our climate governance. We have a very small, they're very dedicated and very skilled, but they're very small staff at the Ministry of Environment and Forest taking the lead on this. We have a couple of scattered people in MEA, a couple of people in DS, Department of Science and Technology. We have people in the line ministries chasing after these missions. There's no real coordinating structure. There was when the Prime Minister's office had a special advisor on climate change. This has become big and complicated enough, and the stakes are high enough that I think we need to think about how we make our decisions in a formal sense around climate change. And I think that's something else that we need to pay some attention to. So I'll just end there and actually leave you with this, with I think the most powerful argument for co-benefits. Thank
Thank you, Navroz. I think you have really set the tone for the technical session. One of the issues that we wanted to look at in this, and we are planning to look at in this work that we start off at ICRIER is what do the co-benefits mean, and how can we talk about that in terms of each of the sectors? Some of that has been talked about in the morning, and now I turn to Himangshu to talk about the IESS model in particular and some of those issues in that. Thank you.
Well, hello everyone, and thank you, Sawan, and thank you, ICRIER, for inviting me over for this presentation. In fact, this is my third turn at ICRIER, and please forgive me if someone is seeing the presentation second or third time. And since this is a technical session, I'm going to get even more technical this time. A lot has been talked about in the morning about this model, which is India Energy Security Scenarios 2047, and before I move on to the presentation, just a quick recap as to how we built upon, how we decided to build a model which is transparent, as Navroz pointed out, that all the existing models, they follow a black box approach. You input something, you output, take an output, and you base your decisions on that. So when you are, and in fact, this is part of a concern which Ms. Naina Kidwai also pointed out in the morning, that communication is very important when you are trying to frame policies on climate change. So this tool effectively takes care of both the aspects. It's transparent, and it's meant to communicate certain policy debates to the audiences. And to be very honest with you, this is not a very sophisticated tool. It's not a modeling exercise per se. It's meant to remain simple, so as to engage as many people as we can in designing their own, let's say, energy secure pathways for India or low carbon pathways for India. So the key assumption that we had, the key concern that we had is, let's say, by 2047, which is 100 years of India's independence, what's going to be our, energy demand? So in terms of energy use per capita, electricity use per capita, we are at currently 800 units, and way below the world average, and US and Europe and so on and so forth. So where we would be in 2047, and to what extent we can meet this energy demand by domestic sources, right? Because of which, what's going to be my import dependence, right? And yeah, so as you keep talking about co-benefits, so let's take emissions, or let's say mitigation as a co-benefit of energy security. So in that context, what's going to be my per capita emissions in 2047? Now can we reduce our import dependence, by either playing around energy efficiencies in the demand sector, transport, industry, agriculture, and so on and so forth, or changing the supply mix in the supply sector? We go for higher percentage of renewables in the electricity mix, or you go for higher percentage of biofuels in the transport fuel mix. Then lower demand means lower emissions. Can we reduce emissions further by altering the fuel mix? So we can generate like millions of pathways using this tool, but there are some key pathways which we worked on, and mind you, these are not planning commission recommendations, they are not planning commission pathways, so this is just to illustrate the power and utility of this tool. Now, so since I've been allotted 10 minutes, I won't really actually go into the tool. This is for you to see. It's available online on indiaenergy.gov.in, and the entire Excel sheet and the entire numbers, projections on the demand side and the supply side are public. And if one is not happy with the kind of assumptions on the efficiencies, or let's say on the deployment of capacities on the renewable side that we have taken till 2047, they can put in their own numbers and see what impact does it make in the overall energy portfolio. So there is one pathway which is called a determined effort scenario, which is close to a business as usual. So all the existing policies are implemented, be it national solar mission, be it perform, achieve, and trade scheme in Bureau of Energy Efficiency or the Green India Mission, or for that matter, so you can think of any policies with the line ministries. If all of these are implemented, what's going to be my energy demand in 2047, and how would my supply mix look like? So this pathway does talk about that, and we see, how would India's energy story look like in 2047. So we say that in this scenario, our demand for energy will shoot up by 4 times, right? And electricity demand will shoot up by 5 times. Renewable share in the grid will only be 12% in 2047 compared to 4% now in 2012. So 2012 used to be our base year. So similarly, overall import dependence will increase to 62% as compared to 31% in 2012. So my overall import dependence is going to become twice in 2012. Now import bill will inflate by 8 times to approximately $1 trillion per annum. And when you sort of compare it with per capita income, so every Indian will end up paying 10% of his income in importing fossil fuels in 2047. And then emissions per capita, which has been talked about a lot in the morning, will increase from 1.4 to 5.1 tons of CO2 per capita. And so this 1.4 figure is a bit different from 1.7, which was talked about in the morning, because we have not actually factored in non-energy emissions into this tool. Now let's say if we sort of intervene in the demand side and sort of advocate for energy efficiency reforms in all the demand sectors, how much reduction in import dependence can I entail, and what's going to be the co-benefits of that? So we say that in the present policy scenario, this is my import dependence, which is how I'll be importing 17,000 terawatt hours of energy in 2047, right? Which is like 62% of the primary energy supply in 2047. And by playing around, we have 5-star increased penetration of 5-star appliances in buildings. We have we exploit a maximum penetration of PAT in all my PAT sectors. I advocate for people to shift to public transport. I advocate for maximum penetration of electric vehicles when we, let's say 80% of two-wheelers in 2047 will be running on electricity. 60% of four-wheelers will be running on electricity, and 40% of buses will be running electricity. So mind you, these are all heroic assumptions, but the kind of problem that we are looking at, these heroic assumptions might not look heroic at that point of time. And then, so what we observe from here is, so after intervening in the demand sectors, I can reduce my import dependence to 49.5%. So this is my base year import dependence. This is going to be import dependence in 2047, 62.4%. And if I intervene in demand sectors, I can bring it down to 49.5%, right? And the majority and the buck lies with all these 3 sectors, buildings, industry, and transport. So buildings are going to contribute 30%, more than 30% in the reduction in import dependence. Industry, so energy efficiency reforms in the industry will contribute another 20 to 25%, and transport will contribute another 18 to 20%. So these are the 3, sectors which we might want to focus when we are talking about energy security. And mind you, so there are co-benefits which we have highlighted in the table presented below. So when I do that, my emissions in per capita is 1.4 in the base year. Is going to, in the present policy, might shoot up to 5.1. But if I intervene in demand sectors, I'll be able to bring it down to 4.2. So we are able to achieve both our targets, energy security and emissions per capita. And then this is going to be my emission intensity of the GDP. Now, so I have 2 choices. Once I've intervened in the demand sector, whether I can go for a moderate carbon energy security, right, which sounds music to a lot of politicians in India right now, or I can go for low carbon energy security, which requires a lot of really heroic efforts in the demand side and in the supply side, right? So when I do that, this is going to be my contribution from all the supply sectors. So let's say in the previous